Tens of thousands of faithfuls continue to flock to St. Peter's Basilica with only one purpose: to catch a final glimpse of Pope Francis, say goodbye, and give thanks.
On Easter Monday, April 21st, 2025, Pope Francis's life came to a quiet end, but his voice continued to echo through his final warnings. His last words were simple, but the prophecy he left behind was anything but. In this script, we uncover the final moments of Pope Francis, the terrifying truth he spent years revealing, and the impact his death has had on the Church standing at a crossroads. A calm, solemn energy filled the center of Vatican City on Easter Sunday. The bright sky that greeted the daybreak of April 20, 2025, illuminated St. Peter's Square, where throngs of people had congregated for the Easter Mass. Pope Francis, his slender figure dressed in plain white vestments, sat humbly in his wheelchair in the middle of it all. Despite the obvious symptoms of aging and disease, he had a soft smile on his face that matched the mood of the moment. Many members of the faithful thought that this Easter was different, heavier, and that time had stopped to appreciate the presence of a man who had led the Church through over 10 years of change and upheaval. Pope Francis was no longer able to communicate with the same force that used to spread his ideas over the globe. Even though he used an aide to deliver his Easter speech, the words were clearly his own: urgent, sensitive, and very concerned. In places where violence has ripped humanity apart, he urged the world community to put aside animosity, forgive without reservation, and seek fellowship. He made a special appeal to areas engulfed in continuing hostilities, such as Gaza and Ukraine, which he had always kept in his thoughts and prayers. As the message reverberated throughout the square, both pilgrims and locals listened with a mixture of respect and sadness, feeling that these might very well be some of his final words in public. Those in attendance were aware of the moment's significance. Here was a guy who had dedicated his life to serving others over gaining power, kindness over condemnation, and simplicity over grandeur. Now, in his last public appearances, he lived out all he had taught, smiling warmly but feebly, blessing babies, and waving softly to audiences too large to really see. Everyone in the square appeared to be aware that history was being written in front of them, not with much fanfare, but with a human dignity that was both delicate and timeless. Many remained after the Mass came to an end, and the crowds began to thin out, unwilling to part with the presence of a shepherd who had walked so closely alongside them. The scenes were reported by news organizations worldwide, but the people who saw it directly carried the deeper reality with them. It was more than just a papal speech. It was a silent recognition that an age was coming to an end, a farewell wrapped in blessings. Silently, the hours passed into the night. The Holy Father was kept under close observation within the confines of the Domus Sancti Marthae, the humble home that Pope Francis had preferred to the opulence of the Apostolic Palace. Those who were close to him reported a calm spirit despite his deteriorating health. His body was frail from years of health issues, and his breathing had grown shallow, but his heart was unwavering. Early on Easter Monday, April 21, 2025, at exactly 7:35 a.m., the Vatican announced the news that would break the morning silence. Pope Francis had died quietly. Vatican officials in attendance said that among his last mumbled words was a straightforward but profound prayer: "Lord, I love you." It was a farewell perfectly appropriate for a man who had dedicated his life to demonstrating that faith was more about a close, living relationship with God than it was about doctrines. Even though everybody knew that his health was deteriorating, his death nonetheless came as a shock to the globe. The guy had returned to the home of the Father he so devotedly served after spending his last Easter calling on humanity to show mercy and make amends. As the news spread around Rome and beyond, focus shifted to a topic that Pope Francis had brought up numerous times while in office. To many, this topic may be interpreted as the terrifying secret that he attempted to prepare the world to confront. He had been speaking urgently for years about what he called the piecemeal Third World War. He warned of a slow, slithering global conflict that was not visible in the headlines, but was evident in the growing hatred, regional conflicts, religious persecution, mass migrations, and environmental destruction that were taking place all around the world. There was no battlefield in this conflict, but it was felt in shattered cities, charred forests, broken hearts, and splintered communities. Pope Francis had made clear how dangerous it is to ignore environmental devastation. In addition to advocating for improved recycling practices, his encyclical Laudato Si, published in 215 CE, was a foreboding warning that the earth, which had been abused and exploited, would ultimately rebel against its abusers. He insisted that the condition of the poor and the planet's health were interlinked threads that were unraveling before humanity's indifference, and he frequently connected the environmental crisis with the social problem. In his final Easter speech, he reaffirmed these cautions, presenting them as existential threats to humanity's destiny rather than as political talking points. It is evident from considering these recurring themes that Pope Francis's purported secret was neither a covert plot nor a shocking last-minute reveal. He had been saying the same unsettling and unrelenting truth for years, that mankind was at a crossroads, and that if we did not choose stewardship, mercy, and togetherness, the future would be bleak and irrevocable. His passing, which took place on the day that Christians celebrate resurrection and new life, became a final reminder to consider these facts. The big bells in St. Peter's Square started to ring out in a melancholy beat. Pilgrims returned with rosaries, candles, and flowers. Some had been there only the day before to celebrate Easter. While some knelt in silent prayer, several wept out. His death was now observed by the city that had witnessed his last blessing. People stopped to pray, grieve, and think at far-flung places all across the world, from the packed churches of Manila to the modest chapels of Buenos Aires, from refugee camps to opulent cathedrals. That dawn, Rome itself seemed to breathe differently. The demand for red roses and white lilies was too great for florists to supply. Confessionals were manned by priests. The desire to be a part of something greater than themselves drew both the curious and the pious to St. Peter's Basilica. Preparations for the revered ceremonies that would commemorate the shepherd of Rome's death started in the Vatican's hallways. But even as the mourning process got underway, many who fully comprehended the gravity of Pope Francis's warnings began to contemplate more deeply. An institutional program that was to be mechanically followed was not something he had left behind. He had left behind a plea for profound change and a moral roadmap. The issue that silently became louder as the faithful mourned was whether the church and the world it served would have the guts to listen to his last appeals. As the news of Pope Francis's death spread, the streets of Rome were still weighed down by the sorrow of loss. The Vatican has started the complex and long-standing procedures that come with a pope's death as early as Easter Monday. Vatican officials and aides moved with profound differences within Domus Sanctae Marthi, where he had opted to live modestly instead of in the papal residences. His body, meticulously prepared in accordance with custom, was handled with the respect and simplicity he had consistently emphasized throughout his life. A new rhythm appeared as daybreak slowly made its way over Vatican City's cobbled streets. Once more, St. Peter's Square was filled with the steady hum of pilgrims congregating as bells tolled at slow, deliberate intervals. These few words carried a depth beyond their brevity, a final echo of a lifetime spent teaching that the Christian journey is, at its core, an act of love. The Vatican confirmed that Pope Francis, surrounded by those closest to him, had whispered a prayer of deep simplicity and faith in his final moments. "Lord, I love you." As the sadness grew, focus shifted to the messages Pope Francis had so desperately attempted to abandon. He had not avoided confronting hard realities in the closing years of his pontificate, particularly in his final public appearances. Francis had warned the world that it was ignoring its obligations to the poor, to each other, and to the earth itself even before his health began to deteriorate. One of his most eerie warnings was the phrase he used repeatedly in his lectures over the next 10 years: piecemeal Third World War. He first used the phrase in 2014 when he was visiting Rettipuglia Military Cemetery in Italy. He saw regional wars, ethnic cleansing, terrorism, mass migrations, and natural calamities as all indications of a fragmented global battle. He cautioned that every solitary catastrophe represented a fragment of a more catastrophic, far-reaching reality that humanity was ignoring. One of the hallmarks of his pontificate was this warning. Francis presented the conflict as a profoundly moral one, in contrast to many other leaders who discussed war in purely political terms. He witnessed the roots of violence in hearts hardened by hatred, greed, and apathy, as well as on battlegrounds. He believed that the world's unrelenting quest for dominance, riches, and power had prepared the way for a gradual and catastrophic breakdown. He advised countries to choose forgiveness rather than retribution, and conversation rather than weaponry. Pope Francis became more and more concerned in his last years about the devastation of the environment, another impending disaster. Published in 215 AD, his encyclical Laudato Si was a straightforward and impassioned call to action for our common home. It was groundbreaking in its candor. He linked the exploitation of the poor to environmental deterioration and cautioned that unbridled greed will eventually turn nature against humanity in addition to depleting the planet's resources. He didn't use tactful diplomatic words when issuing his warnings. Rather, he articulated a future in which, absent prompt action, famine, disease, drought, and floods would cause suffering on a scale never before experienced by the contemporary world. These worries only grew in the years before his passing. Pope Francis bemoaned the fact that mankind had not altered its trajectory in spite of international attention. He frequently pointed to escalating climate disasters, such as destructive wildfires and increasing sea levels, as indicators that the planet's boundaries were being perilously pushed. This subject was reiterated in his final Easter message, which he gave the day before he passed away. He urged international leaders to uphold human dignity, preserve the environment, and acknowledge the interdependence of all life. He believed it to be a spiritual commandment rather than just political advice. Therefore, the alleged terrifying secret that Pope Francis left behind was not spoken in secret councils or stored in vaults. It had been spoken frequently, loudly, and urgently. It depicted a world at a crossroads and served as a warning that if mankind didn't return to compassion, charity, and stewardship, it would suffer the consequences of human foolishness rather than divine wrath. Tributes started to come in from all over the world as the hours went by. National leaders, religious leaders, and regular people all shared their thoughts on his passing and the legacy he had devoted so much of their lives to creating. The line of mourners extended past the limits of St. Peter's Square in the center of Rome. Attracted by the deep sensation that they were taking part in a historic and sacred event, some brought flowers, some held rosaries, and many just came to stand in silence. Inside the Vatican, funeral preparations proceeded in accordance with long-standing customs, but Pope Francis himself requested some adjustments. He was known for wanting to keep things simple. The triple coffin of oak, lead, and cypress that is customarily used for popes who have passed away would not exist. Rather, in keeping with his directives, a single zinc-lined wooden coffin would be utilized, representing the humility he had lived by. His remains would be kept inside the coffin, with the lid open for private visits by authorities and Vatican employees, before being closed for the public funeral, as opposed to being spread out on a high platform or catafalque, as custom required. A theological assertion that leadership was about service rather than grandeur, and that death should be a time for solemn contemplation rather than spectacle was reflected in these adjustments, which went beyond personal taste. Pope Francis made an effort to remind the Church of its actual purpose, which is to walk in humility with God and to stand by the least fortunate among us, even as he passed away. A testament to these principles, his burial, scheduled for April 26, 2025, would be a last act of witness from a man who had dedicated his life to pushing the Church and the world to live the gospel more genuinely. On Easter Monday evening, Rome was illuminated by candlelight. Vigils appeared everywhere throughout the city, from the smallest local chapels to the largest piazzas. Young and old faces in the fading light conveyed a common grief and a common hope that the seeds Pope Francis sowed would not die with him, but would instead continue to grow in the years to come. With their domes and spires pointing skyward, the great basilicas stood in the soft light of the night, perhaps praying silently for the soul of the man who had been the Bishop of Rome. Churches continued to exist all around the world, their doors open to everyone looking for comfort, answers, or just a place to cry. For a brief period, a world that frequently moved too quickly had slowed to grieve, reflect, and hope. Pope Francis's departure weighed heavily on the Church as the first full day of mourning progressed. In the midst of the sorrow, both scholars and the devout started to think more deeply. In addition to guiding the Church through a period of kindness and simplicity, Pope Francis continued a long-standing tradition of popes who, in their last days, issued sobering cautions about the world they would be leaving behind. This was not a novel pattern. Pope John Paul II's final words as he lay dying in April of 2025 were straightforward but profoundly poignant. "Let me go to the house of the Father." His pontificate had been characterized by a constant caution against what he called the culture of death, a society in which violence, consumerism, and a lack of concern for the weak were devaluing human life. His last words and deeds were a call to acknowledge the escalating spiritual crisis in contemporary society rather than a defense of authority. In a similar vein, Pope Benedict XVI addressed his own issues in his final years before stepping down in 213 AD. He frequently revisited the concept of the dictatorship of relativism in his writings and conversations because he was concerned that the foundations of faith and morality were being undermined in a time when truth was viewed as wholly subjective. Even while his thoughts were more subdued, they were nonetheless weighed down by the weight of a man who was profoundly concerned about the world's spiritual trajectory. In this regard, Pope Francis's last cautions were in striking agreement with those of his predecessors. Francis has frequently discussed the threats to humanity's future throughout his senior years. He used the phrase piecemeal Third World War, which he first used in 2014 and frequently used, to characterize a globe that was sinking into a conflict. He described conflicts waged inside fractured civilizations, along shattered boundaries, and inside wounded hearts, rather than across continents. He identified the real indicators of a deeper war, not only with weaponry, but also with the desire for dominance, exclusion, and environmental degradation on a worldwide scale. He also never stopped talking about environmental damage. The Earth itself was screaming under the weight of exploitation. Francis warned urgently in his encyclical Laudato Si, which was published in the year 2015. He believed that protecting the environment was a moral and spiritual requirement rather than an elective cause, linking ecological degradation to the exploitation of the underprivileged. He revisited similar themes in his farewell Easter speech, which he gave through an aide, and urged world leaders to uphold the dignity of every human existence and to preserve creation. Popes have a long history of sending final warnings, dating back to the early days of the Church. One such example from the 20th century is how the Church handled the third secret of Fatima. Successive popes interpreted the visions of war, persecution, and suffering that were revealed in Fatima with caution, but also with seriousness. After escaping an assassination attempt in 1991, Pope John Paul II personally attributed his safety to the Virgin Mary's intervention, as predicted at Fatima. Like him, Francis viewed prophecy as a call to repentance and a stronger faith rather than as a portent of disaster. In this sense, neither vaults nor conspiracies were used to conceal the supposedly horrifying secret that Pope Francis left behind. Throughout years of homilies, encyclicals, and private pleas, it was expressed plainly. The message, which was grounded in gospel promise but urgent in its warning, was that mankind was headed toward its own destruction unless there was a drastic change in conscience and behavior. The atmosphere surrounding St. Peter's Square became even more melancholy on April 1st, 25th, as dusk descended over Rome. Pilgrims held rosaries, photos, and handwritten notes of gratitude as they lit candles, their faces lit by the gentle glow of flame. The College of Cardinals kept coming into Vatican City, quietly congregating for days of preparation and prayer. They had a spiritual, not a political, duty to do. They would be selecting a steward of Francis's legacy, in addition to a successor, serving as a link between the past and the future. The scene was very much the same everywhere. People prayed in remote chapels, imposing cathedrals, and makeshift shelters. For the church, some people prayed. Others offered out prayers for harmony. For the life of a man who had taught the world that to be great is to love beyond measure, and to lead is to serve, many prayed merely in appreciation. Early in the morning of April 21, 2025, events took place in a city enveloped in silent grief. Rome, which was frequently a hive of activity, moved more slowly and respectfully. Prayer filled the air as candles burned in windows along the historic lanes that led to the Vatican. Final preparations were being made at St. Peter's Basilica for Pope Francis's burial. Francis transformed the papacy via the gentle force of service and humility rather than by sweeping decrees. The date of the funeral was set for April 26, 2025. Pope Francis requested that his remains be interred in a plain wooden coffin lined with zinc, which was a dramatic change from the triple coffin ritual that had been used for centuries. His casket was simple and plain, a farewell to a man who had always maintained that compassion, not opulence, was the true measure of greatness in the church. Pilgrims flocked to St. Peter's Square to thank and bid farewell to a shepherd who had lived among them, not above them, rather than to see a spectacle. Hundreds of thousands of common mourners were joined by world leaders who arrived in silence over the next few days. Heads of state, religious officials, and community leaders from all continents were among them, each bringing their own recollections and thoughts about a man whose message of mercy had transcended political and religious boundaries. Huge throngs gathered in the square, singing hymns, carrying rosaries and candles, and exchanging stories of how Pope Francis had impacted their lives from a distance. The College of Cardinals in the Vatican walked carefully between duty and grief. They readied themselves for the impending conclave, a somber undertaking steeped in prayer and tradition. The cardinals themselves concentrated on discernment rather than politics, while the outside world conjectured about the potential successor to the Pope. They would shortly cast their votes under Michelangelo's fresco of the Last Judgment, seeking the Holy Spirit's guidance at one of the most crucial junctures in the Church's recent history. St. Peter's Square was crowded with mourners on the day of the funeral. The Dean of the College of Cardinals presided over the Mass, which was celebrated with great dignity. The readings and homilies discussed the Beatitudes, mercy, and service, themes that had characterized Francis's life and pontificate. In contrast to previous popes' funerals, his plain casket was set in front of the altar with lights and flowers, although it was remarkably plain. Even now, the humility with which he had lived remained, a silent witness more potent than words. Following the final praise, the casket was brought toward the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, rather than, as had been the tradition for more than a century, to the crypts beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Before and during his pontificate, Francis had frequently come here in silence to pray. His decision to be buried there, surrounded by people and in the center of the city, revealed a great deal about his belief that the Church should not be found in palaces, but rather in the streets, among the underprivileged and among the suffering. Rome's bells rang out as the casket was lowered into the tomb at Santa Maria Maggiore, their solemn tones resonating throughout the city like a huge collective breath of gratitude and sadness. In addition to losing a leader, the world also lost a living example of a new sort of power, the power of kindness, vulnerability, and unwavering love. Pope Francis's spirit persisted even after the last prayers were offered and the streets gradually began to empty. Even though he was no longer speaking, his words were still heard in the deeds of people he had motivated. His legacy endured in the continuous efforts to care for creation, in modest deeds of compassion, and in constant appeals for justice. Ancient yet eternally fresh, the Church stood at a threshold once more, molded by the memory of a man who reminded it and the world that being a Christian means walking with the poor, forgiving others frequently, and living a happy life in service to others. The video for today has now come to an end. Make sure to see the other videos on the channel if you followed us this far.